Thank you very much for joining our session. The title of it is Youth Well-Being and Belonging in Minority Contexts. I was just telling the presenters I was so happy to be assigned moderator task for this presentation. And no offense to everyone else, but it's clearly the best one on the program. I'm Lorraine O'Donnell. I'm Senior Research Manager at QUESCREN, which is putting on this forum, and I'm very, very happy to welcome you here. We have two papers given by three people. So the first is called Addressing the Ripple Effect for Better or Worse. And it is, you can see the PowerPoint up there. The speaker is Mary Zettl. So I'll introduce Mary and I'll introduce the next speakers now, and we'll hold questions at the end. Originally from Saskatchewan and living in Quebec since 2016, Mary Zettl has worked within the health and social services research space for the last 10 years with university and community-based researchers and research teams. Mary holds a Bachelor and a Master's of Arts focused on societal transition and development. She strives to improve programming access and relevance for underserved populations, resulting in better health and quality of life by integrating participant stakeholder needs and expertise within research. And just on a personal note, one of the best things about working with QUESCREN is getting to know researchers. And I've gotten to know Mary over the years and have been truly touched and impressed by the depth and devotion of the work that she does. And speaking of people, researchers who have become friends, I'd like to introduce John Davids and James Avery. They're going to be presenting Exploring Motivation for Learning French Among English-Speaking Quebecers, which is obviously another topic of great relevance to our forum. John Davids is a Canadian Namibian PhD student who studies experimental psychology at McGill University. John's research focuses on the sense of belonging and political engagement of minority populations across Quebec and Canada. He was recently the research coordinator at the Black Community Resource Centre, known to many of us, leading research on the well-being and vitality of Quebec's English-speaking Black populations. And someone who I hope becomes a good acquaintance and friend, James Avery, is a second-year PhD student studying clinical psychology at McGill University in the Human Motivation Lab, the leader of which is here today with us, Richard Kessner. Welcome, Richard. James's program of study focuses on issues of cultural and linguistic diversity, with a particular interest in mental health outcomes. So, Mary, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lorraine. Morning, everyone. Okay, I think I'm good. I just have to put this on. Okay, so I'm excited to be here to present this work. So I'm an independent researcher consultant. As I said, I have some experience in academic as well as community, striking out on my own to provide research support, consultation, evaluation, and knowledge mobilization services for especially scientists as well as community organizations to help move research into action. So CASA, if you know, the Committee for Anglophone Social Action based in Gaspé, hired me in February to be to do a youth mental health needs assessment for their community. I'd also just like to acknowledge the people of New Carlisle who were very helpful in sharing, painful stories that they've experienced, as well as the unceded territories of our Indigenous nations where this work is being done. So just to walk you through what I'm doing today. So introduction, the project overview, key findings and root causes, consequences, actions, and final thoughts. So the Anglophone youth are in crisis. And I would say youth are in crisis probably, it's a probably global phenomenon. But what I've heard and seen, I've done a few projects that when the community, when CASA came to me, they said like, we just need to figure out what they need because we're putting on programs and we have no engagement. So that was kind of where it began. And so the project itself was a needs assessment. So the objective was to find relevant programming and activities for these Anglophone youth. I was aware of sort of some of the realities that Anglophones face in the Gaspé, having done some other work. But so I used mixed methods as much as I could. There's limitations to the data, but it was iterative, community informed, and with the intention of taking recommendations and putting them into action. The data collection, I interviewed providers, I'd held focus groups with community, with parents and young people in the community. And then I did in-class consultations with secondary students, which was fun. And analysis, I used in vivo, Excel to the extent I could. I gave students, the participation from students was really hesitant because I was an outsider and this stuff they don't want to talk about. So I handed out sheets to the grades 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11s to fill out while we talked if they didn't want to share anything. So they could share their thoughts. And there was things like, how do you feel on a general basis on, 1 to 5? What's important to you? What would you like to do? What do you do when you're having a hard day? Just to try and get some information from them about this, as opposed to just the adults telling me what their problems. And so, I don't know where the animation is doing that. I didn't realize there's these things on. That's right. So New Carlisle, for those who don't know, Gaspé Coast. So this is Bay Chaleur. So it's about a 8-hour drive from Quebec City. You have Gaspé, the Gaspé, like Rocher Percé and Gaspé up at the top there. And there's Bonaventure and New Brunswick is down here. And just to give you an idea of, this is from Stats Quebec. So here's the Gaspé Coast, here's New Carlisle, as you can see. And just some differences between Anglophone and Francophone populations in the region in terms of age demographics. You've got single parent families, education, employment, and income. So there's quite a, in certain areas, there's quite a difference. So what I found was there's three buckets that I took away. So mental health and the trends in mental health, high multiple anxieties, like not just like I'm anxious socially, it's I'm afraid about the future. I don't know if I'm ever gonna have a job. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to afford anything. As a result, there's frequent suicidal ideation. The educators told me they see it daily, just about. From a school of 150 kids, where there's 70 secondary students. Daily, they see this. I talked to the DPG who said she's never in 30 years seen it this bad so young. They have kids as young as 9 in readaptation centers who try to take their lives. Self-harm, lots of cutting, and also food. I know this is depressing, but we'll get to the hopeful stuff. Eating disorders, a lot driven by social media. And then we have unable to emotionally regulate or process, like they just can't cope. So they act out, or they shut down. And then there's education. So high dropout rate, the grade 9s this year that I spoke with, there was 18 of them, and the dropout rate, like there's like 10 or 11 of them that are moving into a work-oriented training program or leaving school altogether. So the dropout rate is over 50% between 9 and 10. They have no motivation, a lot of individual education plans, so things tailored because they're unable to engage in school and perform in school. Low literacy, and that's not just reading and writing, like some kids can't even spell their names by grade 9. And also like around health literacy, financial literacy, media literacy, digital, like those things. They're on their phones, but the information's coming at them. They don't know how to seek out information, to process, to filter. And then probably for most of you here is not surprising, inadequate service access, resourcing, and availability. So especially with the language laws that have been implemented and the way they're being applied, things like the CIST and ENVIZSAGE website has no English on it anymore. Services, if Anglophones go to advocate for themselves and for their services in English, they just don't receive any services, even in French. Their services are cut. Social workers are in burnout and shifting just back to francophones because they don't have enough English to engage with francophones. There are French community providers that are wanting to reach the Anglophones, but they don't have English speaking staff. And so they're working with English speaking community providers to try and figure out a solution. But so then there's stigma also within the community is another big one from the francophones towards Anglophones. So a quote here just from a parent who has a young nonverbal autistic child. Education moved from 5 days a week to 1 hour a week. Services, babysitting services were cut back and restricted. And when she was talking to a provider saying like, what am I supposed to do? The provider said, just go on welfare. And she said, but I have a job I love. Like I don't, and like I need respite. Like this, and this child is nonverbal, no speech pathology, nothing. So, root causes of this, and also unsurprisingly, intergenerational trauma was the biggest one that came, like so much trauma, everyone said that. Housing and food insecurity, we've got families that rely on the food bank, you can only access the food bank like 3 times a year. So there's a lot of kids that don't know where their next meal is coming from, lots of seniors as well go without. The only grocery store in the area, well, not only grocery store, but the closest one is 10 kilometers down the road. There's no public transport. There's a diner in town and a cafe and a canteen, and that's it. Parentification of children. So children are coming to school, 7, 8 years old, asking about welfare, wanting, getting caught with drugs, wanting to sell it because they want to make money to help their parents. There's limited or no English language services, as I mentioned, multiple forms of abuse, cyclical poverty and income security, exposure to drugs, speed and crack are like the big things in this community of 1,300 people that has a population that's 80% Anglophone. So it's really challenging. I mean, it's not all bad, but I had as an anecdote, I did a youth Anglophone profile for the Gaspésie a few years ago. And one of the interviewees was a social worker who was from I can't remember the name now, all of a sudden it's left me, but he's an Indigenous social worker. And he said that Anglophones in the Gaspé region are socioeconomically equivalent to on-reserve First Nations in other parts of Canada. So having an Indigenous social worker tell me that, and I'm from Saskatchewan where we see that disparity, it hit me between the eyes. So limited employment opportunities, social isolation, lack of sense of belonging, stigma for being an Anglophone, and then also just the insurmountable reality of remoteness and rurality. You have so much public money, everybody in the region needs to be able to access this stuff. So there's that challenge between logistics of access. And what the kids, now here's slightly positive. So they said, the kids' worlds are open, they don't want to engage in education, they just can't this and that. What the kids had to say in summation, they want activities. They don't have any activities for them in the community. They had a basketball court, the municipality took it out. They said they're going to give them another one, but they don't know when that's happening. So they want sports, they want art, they want community activities. They want to learn skills and so that they can apply them. I had one like grade 11 said, I want to just learn stuff that I can actually use in my life. Family and social connections were the most important to them, with money being second. And despite people saying like their worlds are small, which they are, and they don't want to take risks or be exposed to anything, they want to learn about the world. I had multiple students say, I want to travel, and they want to go to Australia, they want to go across Canada, and they want to go see Serbia and Greece, and they want even like to learn about the world in their classrooms. They want to do things that apply, like let's solve the problem of poverty in an African country, the person said. And so I was like, okay, so maybe you guys do want to be educated, right? And they also said with French skills, they want to learn applicable French. So the way they're being taught French, they don't feel like they're gaining a sufficient amount of French to go out into Quebec and actually access jobs. In addition to this, I've talked to some young people who they're bilingual English and French. One went to a French immersion school, the French system, I should say, the French system, not French immersion. And they were bullied, they admitted to being bullied from kindergarten to grade 11. And their mom was in the session and found out then, had no idea that as an Anglophone was bullied every single day for all those years as a bilingual Anglophone French, but had English as mother tongue in a French system. And also Anglophones who leave the region, who seek out education in places like New Brunswick, have reported coming back with like a diploma of business administration or a bachelor in sociology and youth justice, and told by whoever they're applying for jobs for that their education is not valid or applicable because it's English and it's from another province. So yeah. And they did ask for a different approach to teaching. They don't want the smart boards anymore. They want engagement, they want better qualified teachers, which can be challenging because the towns are small, it's hard to recruit and retain people. But they want to be engaged in their learning and they want it to be applied so that they feel ready for when they're leaving school. So as this, the image that I've selected, this ripple effect, if you know anything about intergenerational trauma, is that it spills from one generation to another, hence the ripple effect inwards. And what we want is the ripple effect outward. If someone is taken and nurtured and cared for, they become a contributing member of their community. They work in the system, like they're not a dependent on the system, they engage with the system. And that's what politicians and people with purse strings need to understand, that you're funding social services as a preventative measure because it pays a social ROI where people then engage in the economy that wouldn't be able to otherwise with these extra supports. So, as you can see, here's what we're already seeing: outmigration of the best and brightest, productivity loss for the economy, increase in crime and addictions. There's also, like within education, if they go to this work-oriented training program, children are labeled as throwaways. They feel like throwaways. They're labeled as slow. They are then basically, it closes them to any opportunities to advance into like finishing high school, CEGEP, anything outside of basically you get a WOTP like mark on your transcript and you're like, oh, you're too, you don't have any skills or ability to learn anything, is sort of how they're labeled. And a lot of kids with behavioral issues who are struggling at home are being placed into these courses. So it's perpetuating the entire situation, or they have learning disabilities and the schools don't know how to address them. So now to like, what are we gonna do about it, right? Because I'm all about like solutions, active oriented solutions. So underway and recommended, because as I talked to a lot of providers, I was like, what about this? They're like, oh yeah, we're doing that. Oh, what about this? They're like, oh, we're doing that. So ongoing in the short term, there's a task force of providers. The community providers are like the glue right now. They are driving all of the support that's being implemented in these communities and helping these individuals. And so they're coming together, building a network, sharing resources, sharing expertise, and obviously doing a youth health, mental health needs assessment so that they can implement recommendations to further help these kids. Community programming. So they have youth coordinators that have a youth program, and every year they sit down and at the beginning of the year, they talk with the kids about what do you guys want to do for the year? What kind of snacks do you want? What do you want to call your group? So it provides that sense of belonging short term for them. And then they've established a community liaison that works with like the most vulnerable, hardest to engage families who have like, oh my God, the stories that I heard would blow your hair back. So she liaises with the DPG, Youth Protection and Health Services, and it's not really intervention, but they trust her. She's like a mama hen in the community. And so these families that have like just they have the worst, saddest stories. And so she's in there like getting them crisis support, trying to bring them to meetings and stuff like that. So they're doing that now, but they need more resources. They need more people like her. Recommended is enrich the school curriculum, you know, like add a little bit more content, teach the kids about the world, teach them about different cultures, teach them how to critically think. We're gonna need that. Offer sports and arts activities, especially the boys. Like the group of grade 9s was mostly boys, and it was like Lord of the Flies, trying to get them to talk the entire time, like keep them on task. Like, guys, I asked you a question. Stop asking me questions about drugs. Like, let's move down the road here. So, and then offer tutoring help. A lot of kids said they needed more time with a teacher or with a tutor, space to study that's quiet. Medium term, there's a Roots of Resilience mental health project that's just been started, and so it is addressing mental health. And they'll be, I believe, implementing some of the. I'm working with them to align the recommendations to make sure where my recommendations would fit within this. Skills training for community and CIS staff. So one thing is that was interesting was they said that even though the Anglophone community only comprises about 10% of the population in the Gas Bay, they make up 40% of cases with the DPG. And a lot of time there's like an increase in signalement to the DPG that have gone on. It's like, was 1,200 10 years ago, it's 2,000 already this year. And sometimes that's a function of people just don't know where to turn anymore. They're like worried about a kid and they don't know who to call, they don't know what to do. So training for the community and for CIS staff on like, who do you direct where and how do you access? Even the social worker tried to access someone for one of the kids. It took her 3 days and she's francophone and knows the CIS system, and it still took her 3 days to figure out how to contact the person that's supposed to be the resource person for mental health and CIS for youth. More social workers in schools. It's one really great thing that the Eastern Shores School Board did is they put the social workers back in the schools to support these kids. Otherwise the DPG would have to be there basically all the time with an office. The problem is that they give the social worker like 5 territories to cover. So their territory is like 5 schools and like 100 kilometers in between the two. So they're driving back and forth. And they also don't have clinical support. So they burn out, they get traumatized vicariously through a lot of the stuff that they're encountering. And then they leave the profession to go do something that's less difficult emotionally. Recommended is offer the skills and resilience programming. There was a presentation yesterday that set me on fire, and I'm going to make sure that they implement that one in the Gas Bay because it's going to help the kids and it's already like a proven model. Implement evaluative tools. I found there wasn't a lot of stuff. There's pilots, pardon me, but that they don't evaluate their projects sufficiently to like then like there's no plan to like the pilot's done. Let's put together the evaluation of like what the impact was so that we can apply for more funding, you know, or was the engagement there? How can we change it or modify it so we can improve the engagement? Build up the community liaison team. Right now, the community liaison person is one person who also like manages an old folks home. And so she's like burning out and running on fumes, and they need teams, and they're also people from the community that might not have the background or the education to do this. So they need additional resources with like setting boundaries and understanding, you know, how to cope with a lot of the things that they confront, especially because of some of the trauma that they experience just by seeing some of these situations. And I'm just double checking my time.
You're good.
Okay. Yeah. I'm almost done. So, and then create bilingual English essential positions within CIS and DPG frontline. This I know is probably very hard to do. It wouldn't be like English only, but I heard another anecdote that only 1% of healthcare providers in the CIS are Anglophones, like English only. And so, but we're, you know, 10% of the population. And so having someone bilingual, but who's English first on the front lines at the CLSC, when these individuals are coming in, will help with engaging in services more readily. So I have, and you know, the CIS and the DPG at the higher levels both really want to make sure that Anglophones have access. They're doing everything they can. Like, it's not that things aren't being done, but it's somewhere between the top and the bottom that whether it's like the the empathy for the community, or it's the understanding, or it's the application is missing the mark. And people are really frustrated. The focus groups were like venting sessions for the parents. So long-term, there's a youth mental health initiative with CHSSN, who does all kinds of great funding programs for all kinds of community supports for Anglophones. And so this is within that. Improve the retention of personnel at the CIS, as I mentioned, there's high turnover and they're hard to retain. Providers developing innovative solutions. So sometimes it's hard because providers have an innovative solution, but it has to fit within certain funding brackets. And so sometimes things don't get funded that are really needed because the funders say it has to be health promotion, and rather than it can't be an intervention. So if it's defined as an intervention, and then it also like has to have a real mental health focus sometimes, where these individuals don't want to engage in mental health. I had a kid say like, we're sick to death of workshops on mental health. Like we just want to learn applicable skills and have our needs met. So it's a function of offering programming that like addresses like social needs and helps build skills. And then so the recommended was a community center or a multi-service center where the kids could have a youth center. And secure long-term funding, obviously. So there's a lot of pilots that then get turned over and the stuff gets discontinued. They just get used to it and it gets discontinued. Shift the focus to prevention so from just surviving to thriving. So you need to address crisis, but if you're only focusing on crisis, the crisis will always be there. You need to be looking after those that need the prevention too. And cultivate a sense of belonging. Final thoughts. There is hope. There's hope. And it's really thanks to the community providers and people like CHSSN, CASA, CAMI, Four Corners, the works that are out there that are trying, the Francophone community partners that are coming to the table, that are helping. So it's there, but more work is needed. And that is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary.
Question?
No, we're gonna do them all at the end. Thank you. So we're going to bring up our next panelists, who, as I mentioned, are John Davids and James Avery from McGill, giving a talk exploring motivation for learning French among English-speaking Quebecers. And do you know how to get out of her PowerPoint and into yours? Hope so. Yeah. Okay.
Storage. It's just.
Yeah.
There we go. Someone's name else. Oh, here it is. Yes. Thanks. Thanks.
So it's not showing.
So maybe I'm gonna put it into.
If need be, I'll get our. Oh, there you go.
There we go.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Split this here, so I don't accidentally spill this. Great. So hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming out on the last day of the conference. Today we will be speaking about motivation for second language learning amongst people living in Quebec. And sort of the idea behind the title of Beyond the Barrier is we're looking at, English speakers learning French, as well as French first language speakers learning English. So sort of trying to move in both directions and identify commonalities between groups. As previously introduced, I'm James Avery from the Human Motivation Lab.
Yeah, I'm John Davids, also from the HML, Human Motivation Lab, and we have someone who worked so hard with us on this presentation, but was not a presenter, and that's Shayan Fan. Maybe in future presentations you can meet her, and of course our supervisor, Dr. Richard Kessner, who's here with us today. So thanks to everyone for helping us make this possible.
And yeah, we'd just like to acknowledge too that this research was funded by the SHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanity Research Council of Canada. All right, so I'll give you just a brief overview of sort of what we're going to be speaking about today. We'll start by introducing a little bit of the work that we do at the Human Motivation Lab, just to give you a general backdrop upon which our presentation unfolds. We'll give you our theoretical background that sort of informs how we study these issues. Specifically, we talk about something called self-determination theory. We're then going to sort of translate how this applies to Quebec's linguistic context and why we think it's a valuable framework for exploring some of these issues. We'll speak about the research that we've been doing so far that's currently ongoing. We'll give you the usual spiel about methods. We'll share some preliminary results and finally end with what we think are really the key takeaways. And then looking forward, see what the next steps are for us and what we think the next steps are for research in this domain.
Right, so at the Human Motivation Lab, we kind of categorize our studies into two kinds. The first kind is community research. So that's, as the name kind of implies, doing research within different kinds of communities, surveying people in person or online, interviewing people and that kind of thing. But there's two important aspects about this branch. And the first is that we explicitly try to reach harder to reach or historically hard to reach communities. So minority communities that are usually very small proportion of the population in total. And the second aspect is that we also try to ground our research in the current historical context. And what I mean by that is a practical example is that in 2020 or 2021, we were conducting research that asked people about their experiences with the COVID pandemic or with the Black Lives Matter movement. And these days, we're more talking a lot or asking questions relating to things such as language legislation or new language policies such as Bill 96. So we always want to kind of keep up with the times with regards to the research and the questions we're asking our participants.
Yeah, and then the flip side to that is our university goal research. This is a little bit less relevant to what we're talking about today, but important as sort of grounding in our background as we do a lot of research on university students' goals, how that relates to motivational predictors, as well as various different mental health outcomes over the course of the year. And we're going to start to extend some of the research we'll talk about today to those university samples as well. And in between all of this, I've already referenced it a little bit, but it's something called self-determination theory. We'll get into it in the next slides, but basically it's sort of our backdrop upon which our research unfolds. So for that theoretical background piece, so self-determination theory, you know, in broad strokes is really premised on the idea of three basic psychological needs. So the idea being that for humans to sort of thrive and you know, attain success in whatever form that looks like in their life, they need to have these three psychological needs satisfied. So the first of those is relatedness. That's really, you know, what it sounds like. It's feeling connected to other people in your surroundings, feeling that sense of connection to a community. Autonomy is the one we'll speak to the most today. This is really feeling like your actions and your behaviors are motivated by your own values. They're not imposed on you. And lastly, competence is, you know, again, what it sounds like, feeling skillful, feeling effective in sort of the things you do in everyday life. So we'll really focus today, as the presentation topic alludes to, is on opposing types of motivation. So this is really founded on that basic need for autonomy. And so we think of autonomous motivation as, like I mentioned, being driven by values and beliefs, right? It's doing something because you really want to do it and you see the value in it. So if we apply this to, you know, the goal of learning French, right? I might want to learn French because, you know, I think it's really valuable to connecting with other people. It's important to learn about different cultures. I'm really interested in learning a new language, right? It's driven by your own values, what you think is important. On the flip side, we have something called controlled motivation, which I think you can probably all guess what that means, but it's driven by sort of pressures we're putting on ourselves or external pressures we're experiencing from others. This is this feeling of you ought to do something, right? You should do something, you have to do it, right? And so if we're thinking about learning French, this might look like, oh, I need to learn French because otherwise I can't live here, or I can't get permanent residency, or I can't get a job. Yeah, all of those reasons are good examples of controlled motivation. And importantly, as I've sort of alluded to, these differentially relate to progress on sort of important goals. So, you know, we see that generally when people are trying to do something for controlled reasons, there's not as much motivation there, there's not as much persistence towards attaining that goal, and people really thrive in their goal pursuits when they're autonomously motivated.
Right, so in addition to the motivational aspects, another way we try to apply self-determination theory to our current context is through this concept called collective autonomy. And what collective autonomy refers to is this idea that a group you identify with or are part of has the ability to follow its interests, to follow its goals, to express itself freely in any society. So just feeling autonomous, but in a more collective sense as opposed to individually. However, the two are linked, and I'm just going to read two quotes that kind of clarify how so. So it's in part from our socio-cultural identities that we articulate our own personal identities, the goals, values, and beliefs that provide us with a sense of clarity, coherence, and meaning in our lives. And furthermore, group members may experience reduced personal autonomy and psychological well-being when they feel that the collective autonomy of their social group has been restricted. These are both quotes from Frank Kachanov, who researches collective autonomy. And it's just to demonstrate that the personal and the collective are kind of interrelated and interlinked, and something negative or restriction on one can also affect restriction or feelings of restriction on the other. And ultimately, when it comes to collective autonomy restriction, something as a negative, what our working model is that collective autonomy restriction, for example, is felt by English-speaking Quebecers. It will lead to a decrease in personal motivation, which will in turn lead to a decrease in second language development. And lastly, hinder or lead to a decrease in people's ability to adapt to living in Quebec.
Right, okay, so with all that said and done, I'll jump into sort of how we've tried to capture this model a little bit and apply that to our research. So for our present study, this was all survey-based. It's an ongoing study, so we've only collected one time point so far. That was in April of 2025. We have 2 more follow-up waves planned. And we doesn't really matter too much, but we developed our surveys through a Qualtrics platform, which is just an online survey development platform for those who aren't familiar. We recruited large sort of representative samples of English speakers as well as French first language speakers living in Quebec. Through Leger and Denata, who are 2 survey companies. And they're really great because they help us to recruit, as John was saying, sort of historically underrepresented samples in research. So it's very ethnically diverse group as well. As far as our variables that we were measuring, we did all of this through a variety of different surveys, some out there in the literature, some that we created. The first one, to John's description, is a survey about collective autonomy restriction. So this is a questionnaire where you rate your agreement with various items. Might ask you, and we focus specifically on people's linguistic identity. So if you're an English speaker, you would be asked something like, oh, I feel like our group as English speakers is restricted in Quebec or something like that, right? So it's really trying to tap into this idea of collective autonomy restriction. For motivation for second language learning, so I'll again remind you that we had French speakers and English speakers. So the French speakers would be asked about their motivation to learn English and vice versa for the English speakers. And so here we're really tapping into whether people's motivation is autonomous or whether it's controlled. So items for autonomy might be, oh, I'm learning French because of the pleasure of it or the enjoyment, right? And controlled motivation might be something like, I think I'll be negatively perceived if I don't learn French. And then we assess second language proficiency, again, either English or French, depending on the person's first language, through a scale which just simply asks them to self-report their abilities with speaking, with writing, and with reading. And lastly, we assess people's desire to leave Quebec through a variety of items which asked about, active plans, whether they were talking to people about leaving Quebec, or just whether they were thinking about it generally. Actually, lastly, is the isolation and loneliness piece, where we ask people a variety of questions about, degree of connectedness to social circles and companionship feelings in their community.
Right, so with regards to some preliminary results, I just want to describe the sample we had before we actually get into the analysis. And in this study, we didn't own, even though we're presenting on linguistic groups, we also considered ethnic or racial background and gender as well. So this is just the numbers with regards to the sample sizes of people from these groups. We had majority English, but also a large number of French respondents, majority white, but also a large number of Black and Asian respondents, and majority women, but also a lot of men. And we had 20 non-binary or self-defined as well participants. And this kind of table, this crosstab, is just to show that, yeah, we really wanted to make sure that each of these boxes had at least a minimum sample size that was still robust and something we could work with and analyze.
Ask for clarification, do you have any information about the ages of the respondents?
Yeah, so this is an adult sample, it was private, I think the mean age was around 30-ish, but we do have quite a range going lower and higher as well.
So now we'll talk quickly about one of the analyses we did, which was just looking at correlations. And what correlations or Pearson correlations do are just to kind of test which variables have a significant association. So they also tell us the strength of that association and the direction of that association. So essentially, we took the variable of French level and we tested it against some of these other variables just to see what comes up. And what we found was that with regards to positive correlations, autonomous motivation was by far the strongest. And by a positive correlation, what I mean is that an increase in one is associated with an increase in the other. So autonomous motivation and social support, even though it wasn't as strong, was still significantly correlated to French level. Then we also had some negative correlations, meaning that when one variable increases, the other decreases. So they're kind of inverse. And we found controlled motivation to be significant, as was the desire to leave Quebec and a sense of isolation. So again, this is not about causality or saying one causes the other. It's just testing the association between the two, whether it's positive or negative and to what extent they are so. The second types of analysis we did or testing was ANOVA. So we're looking at analysis of variance between the English and French populations. Essentially, what we're asking is, are these groups significantly different across any of the following measures or variables? And what we found was that across each of these, they were. So with regards to autonomous motivation, French speakers had a significantly higher level of feeling that, and unsurprisingly, conversely, with controlled motivation, English speakers had a higher level of that. But it's also interesting to look at collective autonomy restriction. English speakers had a significantly higher, felt a significantly higher level of that, as well as fluency, where again, the English community rated themselves higher than the French community with regards to being able to speak the other language. Isolation was significantly higher in the English community, as was the desire to leave Quebec.
Yeah, just to make sure it's super clear too, for autonomous motivation and controlled motivation, we're saying here we're finding that French speakers are much more autonomously motivated to learn to learn English than English speakers are to learn French. So we're seeing these differences, and I think that's the value in sort of having speakers from both groups, is we can compare how maybe the current context might be influencing certain groups in different ways.
And ultimately, this is just to demonstrate that these two populations are living in not necessarily different realities, but actually experiencing different outcomes across these measures.
So we'll get into now a little bit more of like where we think things are going, which variables we think are contributing to which ones. And so I want to preface this by saying this is all data taken from one time point. So we can't be certain of like one thing predicts another over time. We will be able to answer those questions in future. But I think based on the literature, we can form a pretty good guess about how some of these directions are working. So our first question here is really asking, does autonomous motivation predict change in second language fluency? So if you're more autonomously motivated to learn French, will you learn French more effectively? So we take this sort of autonomous motivation variable, we look at how it relates to second language fluency, and indeed we find that this is a positive relationship. We're seeing that more autonomous motivation is leading to better development of language, and this is what we expect to find. And I think what's really interesting here, and again speaks to sort of the value of having French first language speakers and English first language speakers, is that we can test whether does your first language affect this relationship, or is autonomy more important for English speakers, or is it more important for French speakers? And I think based on sort of the literature, we would want to be able to say that autonomous motivation benefits everyone, right? It shouldn't matter what your language is or what language you're learning. It should be beneficial to everyone. And indeed, we do find that. So when we include this native language, what your first language is, in our model, we find that it doesn't affect the strength of these relationships. So in other words, autonomous motivation good for everyone for learning language. This relationship here, this is now we're trying to tie in this idea of collective autonomy restriction. So again, to what John spoke to earlier with the model, we're trying to see if these feelings in the collective, this feeling in the community and your group identity is affecting your own personal motivation and your own language development. So we start from this idea that collective autonomy restriction is probably a bad thing for autonomous motivation. And indeed, we find that more feelings like your group is restricted, like your English identity or your French identity for that matter is restricted, the less likely you are to be autonomously motivated to learn that second language. And our results bear that out. And then, of course, we take that same relationship from the previous slide and we find that autonomous motivation, so if you have less autonomous motivation, you're going to learn your second language less effectively. And the opposite is true. If you have more autonomous motivation, you'll learn it more effectively. I think one thing I really want to point out here is we wanted to see also, does this feeling of collective autonomy restriction predict, like directly go towards, your ability in that second language? So if I feel like, my identity as an English speaker is more restricted, is my French by virtue less competent? And we found that that wasn't true. So collective autonomy restriction, these feelings of restriction really go through our motivation for second language. It's not that it goes directly to our ability to speak that language. It's really about the motivation here. A lot of information all at once. I'm happy to answer any questions about that after.
Right, so here's some takeaways. The first one being that language acquisition is complex and dynamic. We have to look beyond the competencies of the student and look well beyond the classroom and consider a lot of other factors relating to the environment, emotions, and so much more. So there's a lot happening that to consider when studying language acquisition. As James pointed out, regardless of your linguistic background, autonomous motivation supports second language development and is a super important component of that. Restrictions on group identity, so collective autonomy restriction, negatively impact autonomous motivation, as you just saw in the previous slide. And to further that, Quebec's current linguistic context may be increasing feelings of collective autonomy restriction amongst linguistic minorities. Some of you may not say maybe. Lastly, language learning programs and policy messaging should take an autonomy supportive approach. So there's a big importance on tone and the way things are communicated to us from the top down.
Yeah, and just to jump in a little bit on that point as well, there's been some really interesting research in other domains about how, we can take more autonomy supportive approaches to, language learning classrooms and classrooms generally, as well as to policy making. There was some really interesting research in the field around COVID and how, we could support people's values for endorsing these sort of distancing campaigns and things like that, as opposed to just like telling them, you must do this, you have to do this, when, it is the case, people should be doing that, but there are ways to do it in ways that support that sort of value endorsement of the benefits. Okay, lastly, we'll finish with some next steps. So, I think a primary goal here that we have is really to expand sort of our sample demographics, right? We have a large range in the community, but we'd like to also go a little bit younger and have some university samples, as well as some high school and elementary students. I think, language development is so different across different ages. So it's really important to be able to look at ages where language development is much faster, right? Especially at the elementary level. What role is motivation playing there, and how can we support younger students in order to help them in the future? I think also looking at other linguistic minority groups, so we're only looking at English speakers here, as well as French speakers, obviously, really expanding our sample, thinking of who else might be struggling under current context in Quebec. Additional research opportunities. So the main one being we have follow-up surveys planned. We also have a variety of different variables from our first time point and from future time points that we haven't yet had the chance to look at, but those might be things like intersectional discrimination or other potentially relevant variables that I think are really important to consider in this context. Qualitative data I think is really valuable, and previous presentation really spoke to how much you get from talking to people, right? You hear things that doesn't necessarily always come out through quantitative. I think it's really helpful to have surveys that can reach such a large number, but it's also really important to dig a little bit deeper and ask the people who are experiencing things, what do they recommend? What's going on for them? And lastly is the program development piece. So I think from that perspective, as we sort of already alluded to, autonomy support has been shown to be really valuable in different forms of language instruction or just like classrooms generally, as well as getting people more involved in learning second languages. So yeah, I think those are some opportunities we'd really like to explore moving forward. So thank you all for listening. Yeah, we're happy to answer questions after, and also feel free to reach out for either of us with questions or just general reading suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay where you are. Two fantastic presentations. Let's have another round of applause. This is the next generation of scholarship, and I'm just thrilled at the quality and the devotion that you're bringing to your task. It talk about autonomous motivation. I've seen that very clearly. So we're very lucky. We have 20 minutes for a great discussion. And I would love to hear questions from the floor. I'm going to, if you have a question for either of the presentations, I will go from one to the other because it's better to have a conversation involving both presenters or, you know, all three. And it would be really nice too, if you want to, if you're comfortable, when you have a question, if you stand up and say your name and where you're from, because part of the purpose of this forum is to really serve as a forum, to build connections. And so people know who's in the room and what are the different backgrounds and orientations and interests. So.
Thank you both for the presentation. My name is Em Lucci and I work for the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages. And I had a question today for Jonathan James. I'm just wondering, how do you separate autonomous motivation and collective motivation in a province like Quebec for English speakers who most likely want to improve their second language learning, want to improve their French language skills, but also feel like they're being told that they have to improve their French language skills. So how do you separate that between like, I want to do it for myself and I'm being told I have to do it because you feel you have to?
I can jump in with a few initial points. So I think that's a really great question, and I think that's always like the challenge of, you know, supporting autonomy within contexts where there is some degree of obligation, right? And you see that a lot within classroom context. It's like, well, you need to learn math even though you hate doing pre-calculus or whatever, right? But at the same time, there's some degree to which some teachers are really good at like getting that buy-in from students and others struggle a little bit more. And I think sort of why I referenced the COVID example was that was a really intense period where you had these really strong recommendations. And, you know, we saw that as far as how that might have been implemented at times in Quebec as well. It really like came down really hard and it didn't necessarily feel as though you had any choice. And so I think a really important thing to tease out there is like, it's okay. Autonomy supportive doesn't mean letting people do whatever they want, but it does mean providing sort of the space and, you know, suggesting them tools for which they can develop these competencies while also trying to appeal to values and appealing to those basic psychological needs that I mentioned at the beginning. So to the extent that you can help people feel competent in their learning, help people feel like they're related to others and interacting with others in meaningful ways, if we can start to appeal more to values and appeal less to like harsh authoritarian rules, I think there might be some way to build there. And I don't have all the answers, but that's sort of my initial take.
Yeah, no, I think James pretty much summed it up, and you know, it's very true that we can have both things happening at the same time, feeling controlled and autonomous. And I think really one of the emphasis from today was how, you know, communication is kind of key, and as an educator, the importance of kind of helping your students feel empowered by kind of taking the initiative and cultivating their own passion, as opposed to telling them what to do or kind of pressuring them to kind of move in a certain direction. I think that's kind of like a bit of the key. So in the educational kind of space, I think that's an approach that can kind of help someone who's kind of feeling a bit of both.
Who has a question for Mary Zettl? I do, but go ahead and just introduce yourself.
Thank you so much for the presentations. I really enjoyed it. My question for you, Mary, so Atashika, everyone, digital strategy consultant and graduate student at York University in the Gender, Feminist and Women's Studies program. My question for you, Mary, what do you think would be the most feasible and sustainable path to improve digital literacy in the community that your research was based?
That's a good question. Because I'm not a specialist in that. I think one thing is definitely working through the providers. There was a program that.
Ashley.
It was echoed to Ashley yesterday presented that gives these kids over 6 sessions a bunch of life skills, and financial literacy is within it. But digital literacy, so they're on their phone, so they know how to engage we're using Snapchat and social media, but we have boys gravitating to the manosphere, and we have girls that are, one of the things, as an aside, is that Facebook algorithm notes when teen girls upload a photo and delete it, they'll start pumping out ads for beauty products and weight loss things. So I would say, my recommendation would be a course around, like, not just digital literacy, but like media literacy specifically, like how to differentiate between what is real or like fact versus fiction, how to critically look at like, okay, this person is saying X, Y, Z. How do I feel about it? But then also like, what are the sources that they're saying? Like, why does this resonate or not with me, right? So I think teaching kids skills, and we see it in like propaganda, teaching them skills on how to differentiate between a propaganda message versus facts, like that would help with digital literacy around just like engaging with what is coming at them. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Another question for James and John. I see 2, so we can ask 1, and Richard, I'll get back to you next round. Thank you. Please introduce yourself and feel free to stand up so you're on camera.
All right. Got me notes, so I look on camera. My name is Bridget Glustein. I work for an organization called Les Ouvriers de Montréal, where we get the chance to work with the 5 Montreal school boards and some of this scolaires. And some of the work we've been doing with the 2 English school boards recently, specific to it, as it so happens, we've been looking at grade 10. I'm just saying that in terms of context for everybody, not to say it's limited to grade 10, but anyways, is a question of linguistic insecurity. So what we've been hearing from the representatives of the 2 English school boards is that one of the concerns and kind of the points of view that they have when it comes to kids and French, is that in our 2 English school boards here in Montreal, the kids pass the French ministry requirements quite well. We don't generally have a problem of kids failing exams, yet they find themselves going to the store and feeling that they can't use their skills. And what they've reported on, and it's very preliminary research that happened, but it seems to be more about kind of a feeling of rejection by the majority, right? It's like, I don't want to dare use the skills that I have because I'm going to get laughed at. And these are grade 10 kids also. So like this lives in the head of a grade 10 kid. So I guess my question to you, and I must say, listening to you guys, the part around motivation isn't a part that we've looked at yet, because what seems to have come out of the voice of babes is very much this: the reason I don't do it is because I am scared of how I'm going to be received. So I'd like you guys to talk, if possible, for that matter, I'd like you guys to talk a little bit about the relationship between motivation and the types of motivation that you're looking at, and the fear of rejection, and kind of do those 2 concepts cross, and if so, where and how, to a certain extent. Was the question clear?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Well, at least I guess I could start by just saying like this idea of linguistic insecurity personally is one I can identify with so much. I'm trying to learn French and intermediate low, and it's also just, yeah, as you say, being teased and whatnot. For me, I think looking at the emotional kind of component and the kind of social dynamic beyond just language is super key. If a young person has a traumatic experience at a young age with regards to this learning journey, it could really set them off track. And it's really important to kind of cultivate a space, as I was saying, an educational space that kind of promotes their autonomous motivation. Now, it can go further, and I really do believe in kind of working on social or kind of trying to shape social norms. It should be actually the responsibility of a government to kind of correct a social norm that's maybe toxic or not so beneficial or positive to people. So for me, I'm not a big fan of, you know, what's happening at the National Assembly or with any of these policies or a lot of these approaches. But I think that it is within the power of the state, of the province, to try to work towards kind of cultivating a culture of openness, curiosity, and acceptance of the other, as opposed to taking advantage or trying to kind of sow division and cement division. So that's maybe the best.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I'll add on the other side too. I think, like, you know, to John's point, like I'm a fluent French speaker as well. I was educated fully in French when I was younger, but as I've gotten older, I'm a little more rusty, and already, like, just you get in your head and that confidence goes. So even for someone who considers himself bilingual, it's still challenging sometimes, right? And especially, as you mentioned, for young kids, right, where their confidence is maybe a bit more precarious, and like one of those negative experiences plays a huge role, right? And so I think from an educational perspective, I think sort of to some of the points you made earlier too, it's like having those practical pieces in line as well, right? A lot of the education is like, there's not as much on the conversational side, as my understanding sometimes too. And I think that, you know, the more you're able to cultivate those environments where people can have those conversations, even if it's with other, you know, first language English speakers, I think over time you build that confidence, and your resilience to people, for instance, switching to English on you when you're trying to speak French is maybe a little bit higher. And if we go back to sort of those key principles of self-determination theory, it's really like, if we can cultivate people's, you know, we talked at length about autonomy, but feeling competent in the language, right, through speaking, and feeling like they're able to connect with others in meaningful ways, I think that plays a big difference as far as like how resilient they'll be to potentially, you know, other stressors down the road in that linguistic context.
If I can add lastly, it's also, it just came to me, but also just remembering that, you know, there's also French speakers trying to learn English who also feel deep linguistic insecurity, and maybe that there's an opportunity there to kind of sympathize with one another and connect with one another on this kind of thing. So maybe that's an avenue as well that, you know, we should kind of be getting together, even if we're both experiencing and feeling this, and kind of expressing to each other that we understand, or at least a little bit about their experiences, your feelings. So kind of working to just grow that kind of solidarity and kind of forget any of this, for me, imaginary wall that's dividing, you know, this province over something that benefits ultimately everyone's. Learning a second language will only serve the benefit of this community.
Who has a question for Mary? Richard, you had your hand up for the other speakers, but you get, oh, great, go, okay, my apologies. Okay, please introduce yourself.
QUESCREN, and I'm really proud of James and Jonathan.
Yeah, good job, guys.
I was really moved by the work you're doing, Mary, and I've had this experience before. I had a colleague who worked at one of the First Nations. And my feeling was, I wish I could help. Can I volunteer? Can I do something digitally? Can I go up there? But I know something about community psychology too, and I know that it doesn't work so well when someone from far away flies in, pops in digitally. And the real challenge is finding someone who's in that community already, who could be the main driver of change. And as a motivation psychologist, most of the work I've done in my career is taking people who are highly motivated but in the wrong way and trying to get them to be more autonomous and intrinsic. The toughest thing is when we have young people who are not motivated at all and who are interested in drugs and thinking about suicide. It's just such a sad list. And I know with my colleague who worked in First Nations, he didn't know about something called stages of change theory. And it is very common. People know about it. It's like, and mostly what it suggests is we have to have an understanding of what the community is ready for and what could be like some first steps to build a little bit of a sense of momentum. rather than coming in with a really large complex program that won't be accepted. So, I think too many different things. You know more about this than I do, but I just want to say it's really amazing. I'm sure there's been interested in trying to help, but whether it would be helpful or not, I'm not sure.
Well, to that point, I mean, yeah, everybody, even I was like, oh my God, when I was like hearing these stories.
Yeah.
And from a personal anecdote, perspective, so I grew up in a, you know, I am an individual that came through intergenerational trauma myself. I was on the verge of dropping out at 15. I had a very sort of negligent, like my parents were really abused growing up, so it turned over into our lives. They split up when I was young. I was the oldest of 4, so I raised them. And what made a difference in my life was an adult took the time, sat down with me and said, I dropped out of school and I regretted it my entire life. I'm checking you out for the day because I was working at Burger King. We're gonna have a discussion. She was my assistant manager. She drove me home. She said, I always regretted it. And sadly, she had continued mental health issues, but the social worker at school also helped me figure out how to get into university, helped me figure out how to get financing because my parents couldn't afford it. And I have a master's degree and I've traveled the world. So it's possible, but that's where you can start. And with the community providers that are already there, I'm not the right fit. I'm like an outsider. They don't want to talk to me, you know, but I think mobilizing your expertise, building those partnerships, helping to build those partnerships, helping them find resources, whether it's like coming onto grants or offering your services to some extent, that can then help build the capacity of these providers in the communities. So, yeah, that was my answer to the.
I wanted to say too, I was fascinated by the fact that the high school students want to learn about the world. They want to think about Australia, they want to. And I'm not sure we would realize that that's a way to connect. It's about the world beyond.
And there was one kid even just out of the blue, he said he wanted to go to Serbia. I've lived in Serbia to become an Orthodox priest. And I was like, are you Serbian? He's a white nationalist, so there's other issues. I was like, you know, he was open about like, so there's this like inquiry about the world that I think needs to be nurtured that might be able to help.
Yeah, no, I think you're right.
I'm going to take a moderator's prerogative and ask the speakers something, because we have people from Canadian, sorry, I'm singling you people out. We have people from Canadian Heritage, Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages, and the Gouvernement du Québec in the room. Senior people, deciders or influencers, I'll call them. I would like to hear from both sets of speakers. If you had 1 or 2 things to say to our government, people who are very grateful are here and have been here all along and listening and taking notes, and will bring messages back. What can they tell their colleagues that would be useful for the issues that you're looking at? I'm putting you on the spot, but it's an opportunity. So should we start with Mary?
I always love lots. Well, thanks for being here, guys. Like, this was part of why I wanted to just kind of raise awareness, because sometimes you feel like you're in a vacuum and no one cares about you when you're like in these situations, and it's the reality is like these things are being felt in other parts. You know, whether you're in Montreal or you're in other, you know, the difference is the rurality. So my one thing would be definitely, and I know this is hard for you guys because you're kind of at the mercy of like the government themselves and what they decide to spend their money, but it's really supporting long-term sustained funding for projects. That means also insisting that these community organizations evaluate and report. So whether it's hiring someone like myself to do just the evaluative part, like it doesn't need to be like Qualtrics, you know, rigorous, but it has to have that research or rigor around it to say, here's the impact, here's the social impact that's happening as a result of these public dollars. That would be the first one. The second one is, in terms of policy development, is to really consider the rurality context of this. I come from a place that's sparsely populated in Saskatchewan, and the small town aspect is not just around Anglophone. It's like we're an Anglophone province, but being able to provide services to towns where there's outmigration and they're dying makes it really hard to keep services up and keep things accessible. So when something like a language log is put into place, like the kids and the parents were all like, what's wrong? Why are they so afraid of us as Anglophones? It's not like we're gonna take over. We're only 10% of the population, and they just won't even give us signs in English, like French and English, you know, like. I understand we need more bilingualism outside of Quebec, and I support more visibility for French in Anglophone Canada. But that doesn't mean that it's okay for the government to marginalize their minorities because they're concerned about their culture. So just considering the rural context. So
Thank you. Thank you. And James and John.
I think those are fantastic points, and I'd like to reiterate how appreciative I am that you're all here, and I think it's great that such an event has such a multidisciplinary feel to it. And I think that's the biggest thing for me is like, I'm gonna take a slight tangent very quickly. I used to work in like a forensic psychiatric hospital. And I think one of the challenges that we see, I mean, this extends to all of healthcare and so many of our domains, is that, you know, we have all these different people working at different levels. We have policymakers, we have researchers, we have healthcare providers, we have the psychiatrists, the psychologists, the counselors, all these people, and they're all operating in their own worlds. Like it's all very siloized, and I think those issues extend to a lot of what we do. And so I think the biggest benefit to you all being here today and to everyone coming from such rich, diverse backgrounds is it's an opportunity for us to all connect, right? The more we can stay in contact, the more we can exchange information, and the more we can think of different ways of like producing knowledge, not just through, you know, the academic way or through the political, like the policy side of things, but finding ways to overlap and work together to reach more people and like, you know, do this together, I think is the biggest possible benefit for me. So, yeah, thank you.
For me, like at the moment, it's really a crucial time because division is a very real threat in our society, and it seems increasingly so. And I really, you know, don't believe in this idea of a society being stagnant. Like it's a threat, so we have to kind of be able to address what's this trend. The lives of Canadians at the moment are kind of being felt in a lot of difficult ways. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of legitimate grievances with regards to our environment and kind of policy and how what the governments are doing about it. So all I'm gonna say is, you know, with this division, I think we have to do and go completely the opposite way and work on kind of trying to develop some sort of unification and common sense of identity, of community, and that kind of thing. And I think when you have one governing power that has one vision and another that has a very different vision, it's a bit of a tension there, kind of like the autonomous motivation and the control kind of happening at the same time. So I think it's very crucial for every Canadian that the provincial and federal bodies of power are able to kind of speak in a way that's unified, a bit more aligned, because people, I think, and it's not to point a finger, it's just to say that these are both very important actors or institutions in every Canadian's life. And it's especially important now during a time of, you know, great trial or great difficulty to kind of express and kind of have a unified vision, because these fractures, it threatens the very fabric of the country. Nothing is taken for granted. And if you lose a big group of people, if you lose people, if they lose the belief that they're part of the community and they can be active members, it's so hard to get them back. Maybe even, I don't want to say impossible, but it's you know, it's so difficult. So let's not go there. And that's the kind of the direction we're kind of moving in, unfortunately, but I still think it's time and the willingness to put the brakes on that and take a very radically different kind of approach with how both sides communicate with Canadians.